Thank you. Good morning, audience. Uh, Welcome back to the conference. And today we have Professor Inseop Shin in front of us to present a paper entitled Post-colonial Narratives of Korean-Japanese Literature, Ethical Issues for the Displaced. Before we start the conference, I would like to read the background information of Professor Inseop Shin. Professor Inseop Shin is a professor of literature at Konkuk University, Korea. He is also the director of the Center for Asia and Diaspora. He is also an editor of the Korean Journal of Japanese Language and Literature, and also the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Konkuk University. He also serves as an advisor of the Japanese Language Literature Association of Korea. Another position that he has is as an editorial board member of Interdisciplinary Studies of Literature, a journal, and as a leading scholar of diaspora culture and multicultural literature in Korea, he has organized many academic conferences and special issues for Universitas, that's monthly review of philosophy and culture. He is also a member of the Book Recommendation Committee at the National Library of Korea. He previously served on the review board of the National Research Foundation of Korea and has earned major research grants from the Korean government. Currently, he is the head of Global Bridge Research. In addition to numerous articles, his book publications include Light and Dark of Modern and Contemporary Japanese Culture, which was selected as an excellent academic book by the Korea Publishing Foundation. Dear audience, please welcome Professor Inseop Shin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sarwoto. Selamat pagi. I am Inseop Shin, as mentioned in my introduction. I wish to express my sincere appreciation to the conference chair, Mrs. Teresia Enni, who invited me to attend, and to Professor Maria Luisati Reyes, who introduced me to this conference. I would also like to thank the conference officials. I believe without a doubt that this conference will become more and more prosperous. I majored in Japanese modern literature. Today, I would like to introduce my work, which in the interpretation of post-colonial narratives of Korean Japanese literature as ethical issues for the displaced. I'm going to read from the paper for my presentation, but I will skip some sections. I would appreciate it if you would read those sections. Korean Japanese literature can be traced back to the Japanese occupation of Korea between 1910 and 1945. After their liberation from Japanese colonial rule, Koreans who were unable to leave Japan were faced with the plight of becoming refugees who had lost their homeland. There are various reasons why they could not return to their homeland, but the greatest was that they had become financially dependent on Japan. The confusion that ensued after the proliferation of the Korean Peninsula and the ignition of the Korean War, the decision whether or not to return to their homeland was further complicated. The origins of Korean literature, Japanese literature, can be found in the aftermath of the Japanese imperialist invasion. In order to understand the works produced by those that remained in Japan, it is first necessary to understand the historical terrain that induced their loss of homeland and how they came from being immigrants to being refugees in Japan. This is a map of Korea, which is divided into north and south, and this is Japan. Here is an enlarged map. This is Korea, and around this is Jakarta.
No.
Based on understanding, the paper focuses on the problem of the drifting outsiders represented in Korean-Japanese literature. This is to clearly distinguish the nature of Korean-Japanese literature as from a post-colonial literature. Beginning with the first generation that wrote in the Japanese language, Korean-Japanese literature has progressed into the current third generation. This paper will be discussing the text and context of the major authors of each generation. Immigrant writers of the first generation depicted the confusion and the diversity in experience of living in the Japanese Empire. It is noteworthy that the Korean Japanese literature produced by the second generation of immigrants represented the lives of those that continued to live in a post-colonial situation on the boundary between Korea and Japan. Although aging second generation immigrant writers are still active, and the third generation writers are now receiving recognition in the Japanese literary world. A salient feature we find in the third generation is the struggle to break away from the imaginary community that the second generation writers had fabricated. They were aware of the political ideologies dividing their homeland and the discrimination stemming from Japan's ideology of a single race nation. Yet this dream of utopia in which they are freed from such borders. I'll skip next paragraph. Diaspora literature captures the migrating lives of those that have moved to other countries. Written in either their own mother tongue or in the adopted language, such literature portrays the incompatibility between the lives of the newcomers and those of the native residents. Adhering to these characteristics, within Japan exists the unique genre of Korean-Japanese literature. Korean-Japanese literature was originally written in the Japanese language in the early 1930s by those who migrated from Korea to Japan in the early modern period, as well as by their descendants. During this period, literature works in colonial Korea, called Joseon at the time, still appeared in the Korean language. But as the colonial rule became stronger, Japanese was widely adopted as the language of intellectuals. This led to creation of literary works in the Japanese language. This photograph shows Korean people landing at Osaka port in 1920. Osaka is in Japan. In 1904, when the Russo-Japanese War broke out, only 233 Koreans were living in Japan. Yet, in 1945, the year of Korea's independence from Japanese rule, the number of Korean residents in Japan had swelled to 2.4 million, or about 10% of the overall population of Korea at that time. In addition, there were 2 million Koreans in Manchuria and 500,000 Koreans living in Primorski Korea. This is a photograph of walking with tilt his body to the side during 12 hours a day in a tunnel. With the defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific War, Soviet troops came into North Korea and the US troops moved into South Korea, dividing the Korean peninsula into two ideologies. The Korean people were forced into living in a state of constant disaster. It was during this time that many Koreans living in Japan were able to find a way back to their homeland. This was not a simple matter of immediately boarding a ship bound for the peninsula. Some had to deal with the settlement of the assets we had built in Japan. Without the source of income based in Korea, these people had to assess their risks and think carefully about the situation before making up their minds to return. During this period, at least, Koreans were free to return to their homeland whenever they chose so. This photograph shows Korean residents in Japan return to their landscape after liberation. And then war broke out on the 25th of June, 1950. A hot war erupted between South and North Korea. More than 600,000 Koreans who had yet to leave Japan were no longer able to return to their battle-ridden home country. The photograph on the right shows Koreans waiting in Japan to return to their country, and the bottom is a photograph showing the horrific appearance of Korean War. On top of this, in the middle of the Korean War, the US-led Treaty of San Francisco was signed by 48 nations on September 8, 1951. This completely changed the fate of the Koreans living in Japan. As a result of this treaty, the Koreans who had been living as Japanese nationals up to this time was stripped of this status. As a result, these people who were formerly the subject of the Japanese Empire were suddenly rebranded as foreigners. However, the Korean residents in Japan were different from the typical concept of foreigners. Under the old imperial rule, they and their descendants had immigrated to Japan as Japanese. Instead, it particularly turned them into refugees. Not only that, in the aftermath of the division of the homeland, the Koreans living in Japan were also divided into two factions according to their political orientation, hometown, and the new networks they had in Japan. Some of the Koreans supported North Korea, whilst the others supported the South. Korean residents in Japan who had become refugees and were required to register as foreign nationals were asked to write down their nationality in the registration form. The system was that once the individual wrote down South Korea, a passport for South Korean citizenship was issued that recognized the individual as a permanent resident. However, there are people, particularly amongst intellectuals, who wrote down their nationality as Joseon. To them, choosing South Korea signified that they accepted the division of the homeland. Joseon was the name of the country that was on the peninsula before it became a Japanese colony. And they believed that the land scarred and torn by conflict had to be restored in its entirety. Choosing South Korea as their nationality, regardless of whether they were originally from this region, was contradictory to their beliefs. In keeping the nationality of Joseon, they could not be acknowledged as South Koreans and so were forbidden to travel to the south. They were barred from visiting their parents, siblings, relatives, and the graves of their ancestors. In a sense, Korean Japanese literature narrates the immigrants facing various irregularities caused by post-colonialism, including this problem of Joseon nationality. Korea is currently the only nation in the world divided by ideology and continues to grapple with ideological conflicts. Tracing back to the roots of the situation, we are met with two captures in Korean history that still define Korean society today. The first is the narrative of liquidating the vestiges of Japanese colonial rule. The second is that of the two Koreas and the anti-communist discourse, and the unification discourse still comes with it. The narrative of abolishing all remnants of Japanese colonialism is a critical discourse that claims that the majority of the establishments that took power after independence were dependent upon the intellectual, economic, and human resources that were found in exchange for their cooperation with the Japanese colonial rule. This is an issue formulated by the progressive mind of Korea and still remains a popular subject with the progressive media. Progressive intellectuals and media point out that South Korea had yet to fully clean itself of the vestiges of Japanese colonialism. They claim that the class that served under the regime of Japanese imperialism succeeded the old power after Korea's independence to become the new ruling class of South Korea. Anti-communism and the drive for the unification are like the opposite sides of the coin in the narrative of South and North Korea. It is an ideological construct frequently utilized by the conservative governments in South Korea to secure the legitimacy of their rule ever since the independence from Japan. I will skip 5 lines. The conservative political faction continues to suppress the liquidation of the pro-Japanese past, instead of focusing on North Korea as the main area of concern. The two national narratives originated from the division induced by the occupation of the peninsula by Japan, followed by the Korean War. The loss of sovereignty to the Japanese Empire has created a narrative of laws that still resonate within the politics, economy, and culture of Korea. Oh, sorry. The two aforementioned narratives are linked to the post-colonial situation of Korea, in which there was a collective movement of the people. Without the nation, the people of Korea migrated to Japan, China, and Russia during the colonial period to avoid political persecution and economic deprivation. With such a large-scale national movement, many people left their homeland to never return. Such was the tragic product of Japanese colonialism. Since Korean Japanese literature has such a compelling framework of the post-colonial movement of people, many narratives of the genre feature characters with disruptive and unstable identities. Korean Japanese literature, which lies in the boundary between Korean and Japanese literature, is characterized by increasingly sharp representations of the severity of post-colonial traumas that the national literatures of both countries failed to register. The photograph is the landscape of village of Korean people living in Japan before their revolution in Tokyo. During its domination of Korean Peninsula, Japan not only exploited Korean economically and forcibly draft manpower, but also seized the people under a powerful assimilation policy. At the core of this assimilation policy was the education of the Japanese language. When Korea was part of Japanese territory, Korean riders were also expected to adopt Japanese as their new native language. Writing in Japanese was a logical choice that promised to extend their careers as writers. There are three writers that can be considered to be the roots of Korean Japanese literature during the colonial period. In April 1932, Hyuk-ju Jang won the second press prize from Japanese literary magazine Kaijo for this novel Kakido, which was written in Japanese. The reason why Hyuk-ju Jang's Kakido appealed to the Japanese readers can probably be found in the fact that the novel vividly represented the poverty-stricken life in the colony. Kakido depicts the plight of poor farmers who live from hand to mouth as follows. For the past 3 years, the women folks has been digging up grassroots for food. Severe drought hit South Korea, so they planted millet instead of rice in the paddies and the fields. But even that it did not live properly. The millet and beans harvested in the autumn were confiscated by the landowners, and the farmers were compelled to sun-dry the leaves of radish and Chinese cabbage, red pepper, and bean leaves for food. I'll skip a few lines. If the grassroots in the fields and had owners, the farmers would have starved to death and no one would have survived. Due to the reception of this narrative of the devastations of people in the colony caused by famine, Hyuk-ju Jang moved his home from Korea to Tokyo. He was trying to achieve success with novels written in the Japanese language. The complication was that he was not well received when he wrote in a similar fashion to the Japanese writers in the Japanese literary world. The Japanese literary world had a high opinion of Hyuk-ju Jang because he provided the exotic taste for the colonials that Japanese readers found interested in. Unaware of this, Hyuk-ju Jang was trying to assimilate into the empire of imitating the Japanese literati in close contact with the literature of the mainland. I'll skip 3 lines. Ultimately, after the liberation of Korea, he was naturalized in Japan and lived the rest of his life as a Japanese citizen. This photograph shows a rice being taken from Korea to Japan under Japanese rule at Busan in Korea. Saryang Kim took a different path from Hyuk-ju Jang and was a more recognized writer than Hyuk-ju Jang in Japanese literature. Saryang Kim was a Korean writer of the early modern period who went to Japan to study and wrote novels there in the Japanese language. Under Japanese colonial rule, many Korean intellectuals went to Japan to study, including the writers. Kim is famous for the nomination of his novel, Into the Right, for the Akutagawa Prize, the most prestigious Japanese literary award presented semi-annually. Kim's nomination for the Akutagawa Prize is proof of his remarkable command of the Japanese language among the Korean intellectuals of his time. It is of great significance that was wrote literary works in Japanese, competing with the mainstream writers of Japanese literature. Into the Right succeeds in its portrayal of the struggle faced by a colonial intellectual who goes to Tokyo Imperial University to study and dreams of being incorporated into the imperial order. As can be seen in the following quote, the photograph protagonist experienced a serious identity crisis through his conflict between using a Japanese surname and a Korean surname. I don't know when I passed for Minami Sensei. Sensei is a teacher. Minami Sensei within the association. As you may know, my surname should be pronounced as Nam. But for various reasons, I was known by a Japanese name. Above all, it must have been because my colleagues called me so. It weighed heavily on my mind at first, but later on I thought to myself that it might be better this way for the sake of training together with these innocent children. And so I used to repeat to myself time and time again that I had no inclination towards hypocrisy, neither had I a reason to be servile. I found myself preparing an excuse. I will skip remaining sentences. As you can see from the quotes, the hero could not free this desire to be called by a Japanese surname without having to provide a justification for it. I'll skip 4 lines. Kim joined the movement for the Communist Revolution of Korea in 1945, and after the division of the Korean Peninsula, wrote novels in North Korea that glorified the proletariat revolution. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, he enlisted as a war writer, as presumably died during the conflict. This was an act of characterizing the ethical dilemma felt by Ryder himself, who also wanted to assimilate into the empire by writing novels in the Japanese language. I will skip 6 lines. The story of Dalsu Kim, who made his debut after Korea's independence, takes on a different path. I will skip 3rd lines. I will read from 3rd lines. Hence, he has incapable of writing in Korean, born into the Japanese imperial policy of prohibiting Koreans from using their own language. Kim belongs to a generation that could no longer write or speak Korean even after Korea's independence. Needless to say, it was hard to receive Korean education once in Japan. Thus, it may not come as a surprise to find a protagonist in the text who appears to have a complex over not being able to speak Korean very well. The significance here is the homeland, which is always fantasized as a place to return to, was beyond a barrier that he could not breach. He felt detached with his roots. The homeland imagined by the writers of Korean Japanese literature was an illusion pieced together from the collective reminiscences of the immigrants. The actual life in the homeland was a process of discovering hybridity and ambivalence. Seokbom-kim was born in Japan when Korea was under Japanese rule. He came to Jeju Island, Korea, where he lived until 1946, a year after Korea's independence from Japan. That year, he smuggled himself into Japan, planning to stay in Japan only for a short time. However, the Jeju uprising broke out on the 3rd of April 1948. In the turmoil that ensued, Kim had no choice but to remain in Japan. He has lived there ever since. The Jeju uprising, which is sometimes called the Jeju massacre or the Jeju 4.3 incident, can be traced back to the time when Paulus fired into demonstrators on March 1st, 1947, during a collision between the Korean police and the people of Jeju Island. Numerous innocent civilians were killed in the armed conflicts. Interpretation of the incident is still a controversial matter. The South Korean government was established after the US military occupation of South Korea. Dae-soo Kim, who remained in Japan as a first-generation immigrant, and Seok Kim, who moved to Japan just before the Jeju uprising, declared the South Korean government to be anti-nationalist. They supported Il-sung Kim's regime of North Korea, believing it to be closer to the nationalist ideology. However, most Korean writers in Japan are native to South Korea. Due to their outspoken support to North Korea, they were considered enemies by the South Korean government. Their road to their homeland was blocked. Seok Kim opposed anti-nationalism because he overhauled the US military government in South Korea and Seungman Lee regime and triggered the Jeju uprising. Yet, this was not to say he sympathized with the communist regime of North Korea. Seok Kim's epic novel, Volcanic Island, based on the Jeju uprising, depicts a divided nation exercising force over a fragmented people. Kim believed the unified, homogeneous nation of Joseon, before it was colonized by Japan, to be his homeland. Therefore, when the time came to choose his nationality, he did not acknowledge the division of the country into the north and the south. He became stateless and remains so to this day. Living in Japan, he owns neither a North or a South Korean passport. He claims to be of Joseon nationality. However, the country of Joseon does not exist on this earth. This was a terrible ethics punishment brought by post-colonialism upon the nationalist writers of Korean Japanese literature. Seeking atonement for the guilt that feels from fleeing to Japan during the Jeju uprising, Kim forbids himself from visiting his homeland. The tragedy is not unique to the writers of Korean Japanese literature. Within Japan, Korean residents are divided into two groups, those that are pro-Pyongyang and those that are pro-Seoul. This division was source of ceaseless political, economic, and cultural confrontation and conflict among the Zainichi Koreans. Zainichi is the meaning of Koreans living in Japan. The discord quietened only in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Korean writers in Japan gradually turned away from their support of the North to embrace the South. Even during this process, the ethical conflicts and confrontations did not cease to exist. As for Seok Kim, he never intended to support the North, nor could he support the South, where the military regime continued to rule. Acquiring South Korean nationality was nothing more than an act of betrayal to his beliefs. The second generation of Korean diasporic writers in Japan were faced with the bleak reality of post-colonialism that forced them to make ethical choices regardless of their will. Kaisei Lee's works would be found in the description of the guilt associated with his father. I'm sorry. Kayseri was born in 1935 in Sakhalin, which was at the time partly under Japanese rule as the Soviet Union moved into the territory in 1945 after the Pacific War. He escaped with his family from Sakhalin to live in Sapporo of Japan. For Kinutao's honor, he received the Akutagawa Prize in 1972 and was the first ethnic Korean to do so in the Japanese literary world. As an ambitious work as a writer, who is probably one of the most influential writers in both countries. Watershed Above will go down in history as a groundbreaking work in the annals of Korean-Japanese literature. In Watershed Above, the author greatly expanded the narrative possibilities of Korean-Japanese literature. One thing that first draws our attention in that the setting in the year 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. In this memorable year of world history, the protagonist Chunsu describes the significance of the wall's fall for the existence of the Korean residents in Japan from an international historical perspective. Coming from a post-Cold War viewpoint, the scrutiny of the protagonist concerning the Korean residents in Japan is directed inward on himself. He has been in a state of ethical disarray from the period of Imperial Japan up to his current position in the novel. The novel starts with the trip of the Korean-Japanese writer Chunsu and his company around Russia and the Central Asia region. The purpose of the trip is to report on the deportation of the Korean Russians, the displaced ethnic Koreans who had migrated to the Soviet Union in 1937. During the itinerary, Chunsu summons the past to recount ethical problems that have not yet been resolved. Therefore, the title Watershed Above refers to a space where a number of ethical dilemmas are resolved. In the novel, the main character agonized over the immoral choice of his father, who upon the defeat of the Imperial Japan in World War II, fled to Japan with just his immediate family, leaving all other relatives behind. Due to the behavior of the father, the son also feels morally responsible for the abandonment of their relatives. In self-reflection and the beliefs that he was an accomplice to the betrayal. Furthermore, as a collaborator of Japanese imperialism, before the fight, the father was also ethically a traitor to his own people. Chunsu guilty, he turns inward toward his own self, who as a child had fully trust in the victory of the Japanese Empire when he was living in Sakhalin. In the wake of Japan's defeat, the moment they became Korean residents, they suffer from a certain moral guilt. The protagonists criticized thus, nothing is more simple than being innocent. They often say that at that time, they did not know anything at all, children and adults alike. That is actually a good excuse when one deceives others or tries to evade responsibility. They are just like the adults who speak as if they didn't know that the Great East Asia War was a war of aggression. And the protagonist, having inherited the ethical burden of the father, bows down to the ground uprising for secret escape of the Chunsu's family from the island 34 years ago. The case raises an ethical issue that Korean residents in Japan face when they try to establish their own identity The struggles arise from the conflict between their relationship with the homeland and the fathers who are to blame for their situation. In Watershed Above, the motif that comes to the forefront is not that of the accusation against Japan for post-colonial discrepancies, but the image of the incompetent and cunning father. Then it unfolds the story of the son who inherited the father's flaws and tumbles into self-punishment. Thus, Korean Japanese literature torments the protagonist with the ethical guilt of losing their homeland and being unable to return to this homeland, and ultimately condemns them for their internalization of the Japanese identity. Just like the original scene, this threatens to smother the characters and is conveyed through the scenes depicting the father's fit of violence. Here is a typical scene from the solo of the land by Hagyong Kim, a second-generation Korean Japanese writer. My father often beat my mother, ever since she married my father at the age of 21. My father has beat her repeatedly hundreds and thousands of times. He seems to think that afflicting her with physical pain was a form of education. I'll skip through that. My father was uneducated, illiterate, and ignorant. He did not have enough rational control over himself to suppress his temper, and merely wielded tyranny blindly and impulsively. I will skip remaining short. In the violence of father, especially that directed at the mother, is a scene that often appears in the works of second-generation Korean Japanese writers. The gaze of the son, who is the narrator and the protagonist, is cold. The father is the eyes of his son, is not a fearful man, but one that is uneducated and incompetent, a man who has lost his roots and wields impulsive violence to bury his complex. I will skip a few lines. In addition to the political conflicts caused by the division of their homeland, Korean Japanese writers were also burdened with the identity crisis, is being Korean or Japanese. Following Kaisei, Yang Ji-ri became the second Korean Japanese writer to receive the Akutagawa Award with her novel Yuhi. The collected works of Yang Ji-ri includes an essay titled I am a Korean, which begins with I am of the second generation of Chinese Koreans. In the essay, she confesses her dual identity. I am now 20 years old. To speak of my life up until this point, I must mention how I came to reveal that my name was Yang Ji-ri, a Korean. It was only around 2 years ago, in my third year of high school, that I came to acknowledge that I was Korean. Before this point, I would not have in my wildest dreams even imagined who I am today. According to I am a Korean, she was automatically naturalized at the age of 9 as a Japanese citizen due to the naturalization of her parents. The narrator perceives naturalization as an unnatural state forced by Japan. Then she defines herself as being filthy and barbarous. Thinking of oneself as filthy and barbarous is an expression of Orientalism in which Japan becomes the Occidental country. I'll skip this page. The identity crisis suffered by Korean residents in Japan comes out in various ways. The unconscious ignoring of their heritage, a conscious concealment of it, or deliberate disclosure of it. Just like Yang Ji-ri, it is not uncommon to find those amongst the Korean residents in Japan who have been raised in Japan, but face internal conflict from not being of Japanese nationality. During the colonial era, they had no choice but to write from the ethical perspective on the ambiguity of their identities. However, this remains unchanged in the post-colonial era. I will skip first paragraph. With the thawing of the Cold War and the introduction of an era of globalization, the riders of the third generation migrants in Japan view themselves to be situated on national, generational, and cultural boundary, and as such, they desire to walk their own independent path. For them, Korean may be the homeland of their grandfather, but it was not their own. They are not naturalized as Japanese citizens, but neither do they wish to define themselves as being Koreans. They dream of a utopia on the borderline between the two identities. In their narratives, the main characters tend to prefer the separate identity of being Korean residents in Japan, rather than having a certain nationality. They are more engrossed in their own personal problems than the issues of nationality. The novel Go is representative of its generational recognition. Go by Kazuki Kaneshiro won the Naoki Prize in 2000, a renowned award to popular fiction, and was welcomed as a bestseller by many readers. I'll skip the following sentence. Sugihara, the main protagonist of the novel, used to attend a Pyongyang school because of his father, who was a Korean resident in Japan and a fervent Marxist. After the political conversion of his father, however, he switches to Korean nationality and begins attending a Japanese high school. This leads to him being shunned by both native Japanese and Pyongyang Koreans. Yet he overcomes the different difficulties he encounters on the way to finding his own identity. Then one day, he meets a Japanese student called Sakurai and falls in love with her. I'll skip the next paragraph. Although called by a Japanese name, the main character Sugihara is an ethnic Korean with a nationality other than Japanese. In order to relate the narrative of the conflict one must go through as a non-Japanese citizen in Japan, the novels uses the voice of a youth who is a Korean resident in Japan. Sugihara grows up a member of a minority group, familiar with the discrimination ever since his childhood at a Korean school. By choosing to go to a Japanese school, he is branded a traitor to the nation by his former friends and teachers. But he does not care. He says, "Well, I was not so much absorbed in the communist ideology. I just had to adapt to the environment forced upon me and managed to survive in it. But it was an environment that I could not make head or tail of. So I could not help growing up a delinquent with a crooked mind." Don't you think it is rather strange to not become like that? The environment that I could not make head or tail of is that one given to him by his father. Later, the father chooses to go to Hawaii, hoping his son can overcome the environment that could not make head or tail of. Afterwards, Sugihara goes on Japanese school to break out of that environment that I could not make head or tail of, and works hard to find his own identity through reading extensively about anthropology and Nietzsche Act. Once the ethical conflicts arising from the division of his homeland is resolved by the father, Sugiura proceeds to define an identity of his own, and not that of a Japanese or a Korean living in Japan. He rejects the myth of a single-race nation and becomes convinced of the essentially unethical nature of blood ties, which in the foundation of the Japanese discrimination against the Koreans. In the Wilderness, I'll skip at this page. Great or humble, whether like or dead, the narratives of the Korean residents in Japan are bound to face the question of how they define themselves. They who have inherited the legacy of their father's generation of being divided into two hostile groups. This is the reason why an important narrative device for them is the entangled question of ethnics. They ask why I am born in this land as one who suffers from discrimination. Born into a wealthy nation and family, I made trouble and was kicked by father. Proud of my life I have lived, but letting go, I always degenerated into about a dog getting thrown. I was born in Japan. I was born in Japan. Born in Japan and to live in Japan. I ask the question, who I am, and write my narrative of my own existence based on the role model of my father. That is the reason why Watershed Above and Go works based on the real lives of the authors. Took their themes from the ethnics inherited from ethics. That is the reason why Watershed Above and Go was based on the real lives of the authors, took their themes from the ethics inherited from their father's generation. This may be a distinctive literary device we find in the narratives of Korean residents in Japan. I will finish it with this because the rest is repeated. Thank you for your attention. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. We've got a lot of information about the post-colonial experience of Korea beyond the Korean drama that probably is very popular also in Indonesia, beyond Daijangkem and the like. Alright, we now come to the question and answer session. Mbak Kitin will help us with the interpretation. So you can ask questions in English, in Indonesian, in Japanese. Imam no Kiswahili, okay? Alright, for the first session, could you please raise your hand and then introduce yourself before asking questions? Jeremy from back there. Second question, someone from the left wing. Alright, Jeremy, you can go first.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Jeremy from this university. Okay, first I would like to say that this is a very interesting discussion because, to be honest, I know nothing about Korean apart from the fact that it is divided into two and the K-pop and whatnot. So this is a very enlightening discussion for me. But I noticed that there is a quite stark shift in mood between the early generation of Korean Japanese writers and the later, like the writers of Watershed Above and Go, because back then the prevalent mood seemed to be this kind of identity crisis and their own self-disgust of their betrayal of their homeland, while for the ladders, it seemed to be more about being angry, being full of rage because of the discrimination they receive and how helpless they are, how it's not of their choosing and how they couldn't do anything to do it. My particular interest is what about the condition of the present Korean Japanese literature? How the nationality support condition in this particular era. So how do they identify in regard to their homeland? Because if they would want to go back to the ideology of Joseon back then, but now we know that pretty much the entire narrative of North Korea is already out to the world. We already see a lot of Kim Jong-il memes everywhere on the internet. We already see videos of people who managed to escape from North Korea to China. So we already learned of the stark contrast between North Korea and South Korea. So how the modern Korean Japanese people or writers identify themselves in regard to nationality support? So do they still identify in this one Korea ideology or support South Korea exclusively or nothing at all? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
그럼 선생님 마이크 써요. Thank you. Thank you. Question. 먼저 이 배경이 굉장히 복잡합니다.
Saat ini kondisinya sedikit sorry. So the situation not is so quite confusing. And the question was so confusing. And then
퍼스트 제너레이션 1세대의 이주는 그렇게 곤란하진 않습니다. 설명하기가.
The first generation, so the Korean that go to the Japan for the first time is not really confused. The identity is not really confusing because they still Korean that go to Japan.
왜냐하면 그때는 제국주의였기 때문에 이건 선택의 여지가 없었던 거죠. 초이스할 여지가 없는 거죠.
Because at that time they cannot choose because they have to go.
그러니까 일본에서 일본어를 쓰더라도 변명할 여지는 있어요. 어쩔 수 없이 섞어야 되고.
So they cannot choose. So they have to use the what is it? Japanese language. So they have to use it.
그런데 2세대의 경우는 다릅니다.
So the problems comes to the second generation.
왜냐하면 2세대는 자기가 원하지 않았지. 미리 아니에요. 자기 의사랑 관계없이 원하지 않았는데 일본에 살고 있다는 이유만으로 한국어로 글을 못 쓰고 코리안 랭귀지 못 쓰고 일본어로만 글을 쓰게 되고.
So the second generation has the problem because they do not choose it, and then it just comes to them like that. I mean, it's like they only born there and use the Japanese language there. Sorry for my English. So they just do not really have no idea why they are there.
그러면 일본에서 일본어를 쓰고 일본에 살면서 일본어를 쓰고 있으면 일본인이어야 되잖아요.
So when you are in Japan and then you use a Japanese language, so it means you're Japanese, right?
그런데 일본인이 아니거든요, 그 사람.
But actually, the person is not Japanese.
그러면 어떻게 해야 되냐면 한국으로 돌아오든가 일본에서 한국인이라고 하든가 해야 되죠.
So when they want to come back to Korea, they also think it's just like the Japanese that go to Korea.
근데 돌아오지 못하는 상황이 되니까 원래 있던 자리로 돌아가지 못하는 게 디아스포라예요. 원래 있던 자리로 돌아가지 못하는 게 디아스포라.
So, was it?
홈랜드로 돌아오고.
Like used to be, sorry. So it's like used to be. So, so I mean like because they cannot come back to Korea. They want it maybe, but they cannot. So this is diaspora.
만약에 돌아갈 수 있으면 다이아스포라가 아니고 여행자죠, 유학생이죠.
if they can come back to Korea, I mean, it's like the people who live in Japan, the Korean people who live in Japan can come back to Korea. It's not diaspora. It can be just like a study or traveling or something like that. So, but they cannot, so it's diaspora.
그래서 이 세대들은 제 다이아스포라인데 본인이 원하지 않은 다이아스포라들이 되버린 거죠. 제 원치 않은 다이아스포라.
So the second generation is the diaspora because actually they want go to the Korea but they cannot, or maybe they do not want it but they still cannot. So something like that.
그래서 일단은 그들은 뭔가 이야기를 해야 되는데 되게 억울하잖아요. 억울하다는 얘기가 있어요.
잠깐만. 네, 억울은 안 해요. 네.
영어로.
Okay, so because of the situation, they feel like it's not fair or it's not fair or angry, something like that.
그러니까 그 분노를 어디다가 앵글을 어디다가 표시를 해야 되냐면 왜 나를 이렇게 만들었느냐.
So because they feel like not fair, they feel not fair, and then they angry, something like that. So they do not really know how to show it or how to, express the anger.
그러니까 원래 한국이 일본이 침략하지 않았고 조선이 그들이 있었어요. 그래서 조선이 거기서 나옵니다. 조선이 중요한 거는 원래 옛날로 돌아가자는 게 조선이 있었으면 이런 일이 나한테 안 오지 않을까. 나는 조선이 있었지 않을까. 왜 일본에 와가지고 생각을 바뀌게 되는
So Joseon actually the Korean before they divided into two. So means like actually I'm a Joseon people. I'm Korean people. So why I should go like this? So they feel like it's not really fair, something like that.
그래서 이건 논리로 가능하지도 않고 로직으로도 해결이 안 되고 변명으로서 저스티피케이션으로 설명이 안 되는 문제가 돼버렸어요.
So for this generation, the second generation, the problem is in the second generation. For the second generation, they cannot accept it logically, and they think it's not a fair one for them. It's just like no justification here.
두 가지 방법이 있습니다. 두 가지 메소드가 있어요. 그러니까
So they have to method here.
하나는 일본인이 되는 걸 기회하는 거예요.
So they become the Japanese or naturalization.
근데 기회를 잘 안 받아줘요. 일본에서 안 받아서 기회를. 근데 일본 국적을 취득할 내셔널.
But they cannot accept the the right as the accepted cannot accept the right as the Japanese.
Not allowed.
Yeah.
그러니까 받아주지 않으니까 지금도 그렇잖아요. 지금도 제가 인도네시아 국적 없겠다고 그러면 바로 줍니까? 안 주잖아요. 똑같은 거예요. 심사에서 안 받는단 말이야. 그러니까 설령 일본인이 됐다고 쳐봐요.
So because you just living in the country and you want to become the person in that country, but the country can't accept you. Right. So it's just like
그러면 한국인이었다는 것 때문에 디스크리미네이션이 있어요. 일본인이.
So the Korean people who live in Japan and they think they are Japanese, but they find that they get the discrimination.
왜냐하면 옛날에 일본은 한국을 지배했었으니까 지배국하고 피지배국. 내가 지배했던 사람이니까 나보다 못한 사람이니까 나중에 디스크리미네이션이 계속 남아 있는 거예요.
So the second generation thinks that the Japanese actually can be their home because they born there, they live there, but they find the discrimination so high for them, so they just like, oh, I got the discrimination here, so I'm not accepted.
또 하나의 길이 있어요. 아까 내가 두 가지.
So another method is their left.
논리적으로 해결 못하는 것을 문학적으로다가 표현하는 겁니다.
So because they actually, in the second method, they can show or express their anger or they, what is it, not fair feeling or something. That's something that,
Injustice.
yeah, injustice feeling. So they can try express it using the literature.
그래서 이거 논리적이지 않고 논리적이지 않고 여기서 그래서 원문은 안 썼는데 제가 주에다가는 각시만 알았는데 한이라고 하는 것을 표현을 하고 있었지.
So the second generation called them as the Hanil. Hanil is Han from Hanguk, Il is Ilbo. So it's- Han is Korean Han.
그래서 각주 좀 읽어보라고
아니, 한이라고? 한이랑 일본, 한국이라고.
한국 일본의 한이 아니고
죄송합니다. I'm sorry.
In fact, the literature of the second generation immigrants is the core of Korean Japanese literature because they express Han. Han is a word. Sorry. Han is a word used to express a particular sentiment in this is difficult to express beyond the Korean language. The word embodies the deep set pain of bitterness, remorse, grief, and distress. It is the pain felt by those that were forced to live in a foreign land without the ability nor the choice to live. It is a sentiment embodying a faithful bitterness sweet from bitterness stewed from a prolonged and accumulated suffering. Koreans imagine that the sentiment subsequently flows within their people. The following example may help to understand the implication of Han. I cannot close my eyes for the Han that I feel is not being able to meet my mother again due to the separation of Korea. Although Korea and Japan are in close proximity to one another, the sea called the Korean Strait between the two nations has proven to be a great barrier to the Korean residents in Japan. 근데 이 세대는 어쩔 수가 없는 거예요. 어쩔 수 없는.
So the main point is the problem for the second generation is they have no choice, so they cannot choose it.
Right. Is it related to this issue? Because all right. Actually, the question that is addressed by Jeremy is asking about the contemporary writer. How is their attitude towards this change? The contemporary writers.
3세대는 그런 걸 벗어나고 있다.
그냥
다 그대로 받아들이고
네네.
보더라인 속에서.
So this is for the second generation. So now is the third generation. They just accept it like that. I mean, because they cannot do anything about that. But even they cannot speak Korean also, so they just accept it.
Okay. So like they've lost the the lost generation. All right. Thank you very much. Next, Ibu Lianko and Pak Bismoko. Is it okay if we have 3 questions more? All right, and Pak Alip. Yeah. Ibu Lianko first. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Lian Gao, and I'm the founder of Dharma Publishing. And I'm very much interested in the subject of language. Now, first of all, my question is, how come these Korean young people cannot make a decision to move to wherever they want to be, are they politically not accepted? Like if they decide to go to either North, South Korea or Japan, why can't they do that? That's my first question.
왜 못 돌아오느냐는 거죠.
네, 아니 근데 왜 선택하는 할 수 없어요?
왜 선택을 못 하냐는 거지.
왜?
젊은이들이.
네.
실제로 일본인이 되는 선택을 하고 있어요. 일본인이 되는 선택을 하고 있는데 돌아오는 선택을 하는 사람도 소수 있죠. 조금 몇 명. 아주 적은 1%, 0.06% 조금은 돌아오는 선택을 하지만 대부분의 감정이죠. 이모션 대부분의 감정은 돌아오기가 어렵다는 거예요. 거기까지만 우선 말씀드릴게요.
So actually nowadays the young people, they choose, many of them choose to just become the Japanese, and a little people,
Number of them.
little number of the people, they choose to come back to Korea because.
그런데 원리적으로는 돌아오는 게 되게 어려운 거죠. 돌아오기 힘든 거예요. 그러니까 왜 어려웠냐면 문화적으로 맞지 않고 한국어를 하지 못하고.
So why the people who choose to come back to Korea, is a little number, only little number, because they feel that if they find difficulty, it's a matter of the culture, and then they cannot speak Korean also.
They have dual identity and advanced culture for Korean culture. 거기서 차이가 나.
So they find it's different. They find that the Japanese culture that they have all the time is different with the Korean culture. And then the important thing, they cannot speak Korean nowadays.
Well, I'm sorry. That is a universal problem of being diaspora. That at one point you are confronted with the choice and the question: who are you? Where do you belong? And then it is a matter of choice. Well, then stop the Korean business. It's very simple. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. You cannot do that. If they are Japanese and they identify with that, that's fine. That is the passing of time. That is history. But do not claim one thing and live something else. That just doesn't work. Well, but there is this big controversy of who, if otherwise you would not have this conversation right now. We have this conversation because we have this big upheaval of, we are here and we want to go there, but if you don't belong there, you don't feel there, then why make the big fuss?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Yeah, it happens to especially the third generation, because the second
The
generation.
lost generation,
Exactly,
that's what
yes.
I said in my speech
okay.
yesterday.
Okay, Mr. Professor Shin knows the thing that you concern now, but actually they find it so difficult.
Life is difficult.
Yeah,
I am
that's
sorry. You either are asleep and then life is a dream, and you just run from one day into the other. But if you're conscious,
Right.
you have questions, and then you look for the answer.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much. I can understand your concern, Sipuli. Yes. We can continue it after the break between Puliani and Pak Shin. Actually, let's move on to Pak Bismoko.
Thank you. First of all, I would say I feel very fortunate indeed to have listened to your brief presentation, which also one, first, it has, at least, it makes my understanding about Korea better, much better now. And secondly, it has reminded me of my childhood. I was born during the Japanese occupation. It was only brief, only 3.5 years. But I really experienced also the aftermath, although it was brief, very bitter aftermath of the occupation. That is number one. And number two, my question is not so much literature or literary, but wider than the maybe the effects of colonialism. You have said, if I'm not mistaken, that until now there are still 600,000 Sojun, do you call that? Joseon, you see, in Japan. Not Japanese, not Korean, but they are there, stateless. That's not something that is easy to understand. But to your understanding, how about those who fled to China and Russia, particularly China? And then also, they have some kind of Japanese, Chinese literature and Russian, Korean literature. Chinese, Korean literature, and then Russian, Korean literature, and so forth.
Right. Yes.
I think that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pak Bismoko. And then Pak Alip.
My question is related with the language, because first generation might be writing in Korean, right? But the second and the third generation might be writing in Japanese. What I don't understand is why they feel that they are not accepted. Is it because their Japanese language is different from the mainstream Japanese? Because in my observation, physically Korean and Japanese are the same. So whenever you speak the same language, physically the same, then
Skin color.
Feeling of being accepted should not be difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Alip.
설명하고 이해할 수 있어요. 그래서 그냥 그다음에
맞아요. 중국하고요. 러시아, 중국, 러시아.
네, 이게 문화 있어요. 아니면 네.
있어야죠. 그다음에 지금 선생님 말씀하신
외국 사람이
So the first question from Pak Bis is about this stateless 600,000 something Koreans living in Japan. Does it really happen that they don't have citizenship? This 1600,000. And then secondly, what about those Korean who emigrated to China and Russia, whether they also produce similar literature that is the same with those emigrated to Japan?
지금 thank you for question. Chinese 그러니까 중국에도 있고 러시아에도 있고 어느 나라 전 세계 어느 나라에도 이렇게 거기서 하는 문학이 있다. 제 문학 같이.
So for the people, the Korean people who live in other countries, they have their own literature. So they have the Chinese, Korean literature, something like that.
근데 선생님이 잘 지적하신 것처럼 다 다릅니다. 성격이 그러니까 다 달라 디프런트예요.
Characteristic,
종류가
성격은
종류 종류들이 다르다. 왜 다르다고 왜?
But
distinguishing.
but it's different the way they use make it the literature.
중국에서는 한국어로다가
So the people in China they use the Korean way to write.
그리고 러시아에서는 러시아어.
So but in the Russia they use the Russia way to write.
근데 러시아에서 러시아 문학을 쓰는 사람들은 성격이 달라서 러시아로 쓰는 것 자체를 이렇게 안 좋게 생각하지 않아요. 시글 같은 경우는 한 같은 경우는 러시아로 쓰는 거.
So the people in Russia is different. The people in Japan, because the people in Japan they still think the Han thing, but the people in Russia they do not think really much about the Han thing.
근데 중국에서는 조선어로 글을 쓰는데 그 사람들은 한이 있어요. 한을 가지고 있습니다.
Because the history with the China actually, so the people who live in China they still have the Han way to write.
그 대신 일본에서 갖고 있는 것처럼 컴플렉스가 없어요. 중국 사람들 컴플렉스.
So the people in the people who write in China is not find the complexity as the people who live in Japan.
왜냐면 조선어로 쓰니까.
Because the Joseon actually come from the Chungguk, the history.
이 세 개의 나라에 있는 거주하는 사람들은 다 성격이 다르다.
So
러시아, 중국.
So the Russian and the Chinese and the Korean actually they have different what is it? Type characteristics.
캐릭터리스틱이 아니고.
Characteristic, attitude, culture.
Attitude matter. Yeah, attitude.
Okay.
그래서 일본 문학이 일본에 있는 코리안 제일 문학이 가장 복잡하다.
So the very confusing and very difficult things is the Korean literature in Japan.
So in short, then those three migration experiences, I think, produce different kind of literature because the way the Japanese, the Russian, and the Chinese respond to the Koreans immigrated to their country is also different as well. And then regarding to the second question from Pak Ali, usually colonialism, segregation and everything is understood because of the different skin color, different race. But you Korean look like Japanese, so how come there's segregation despite the terms of language? Yeah.
없는데 그게 아까 식민지 시대 콜로니얼에서 지배를 하나는 위에서 지배를 하고 지배를 당한 사람들의 관계가 있잖아요. 그러니까 우수하다 우수하지 않다. 열등한 우수. 엑설런트하고 엑스퍼트하고 엑스퍼트하지 않다. 그러니까 우수한 사람과 우수하지 않다. 인종주의적인 문제입니다. 근데 그거는 인종주의는 브레드 타임. 그러니까 피.
So actually, people think that.
피부색은 안 드러나는 거예요.
So the Korean people still feel that that's different because because they have to move like export something like that, and then the blood is different.
이거 하나. 아니, 그래서 I am Japanese가 일본인이라고 사는 사람이 있어요. 숨기고 그 얘기도 해보세요.
But there are some people Korean that hide. I mean, it's like cover, disguise. Disguise. So they just be like Japanese.
거기에 윤리를 ethical problem. There is ethical problem. 자기의 조국을 자기 나라를 감추기 때문에.
Because and then the problem is the Korean people who live in Japan they burdened with the ethical, what is it? Complex. Ethical.
Tanggung jawab. Ethical responsibility.
So they feel like that because they actually they have to
So,
leave the
yeah.
country, but they cannot.
Right, so actually it's beyond skin color and everything.
So
It's
beyond
something
the
that
language and
how
the
we've been raised and so on.
The ideologies.
Right. Thank you very much. I believe we still have lots of questions, but unfortunately we have occupied like 15 minutes of our coffee time. So once again, give big applause to Dr. Shin and the awesome task of the interpreter, Mbak Kitin. Thank you very much. I return the floor to the announcer. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Inseop Shin, for such an inspiring speech of the rise of Korean-Japanese literature. Now, we would like to present a token of appreciation for both the presenters and the moderator. To do so, we would like to invite Ibu Teresia Eni Anggraini to the stage. Again, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for Professor Inseop Shin.
Now we would like to remind you once again, for those who are willing to have Friday prayer, please gather at the lobby in the ground floor at 11:30, and the committee will guide you to the nearest mosque.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a 30 minutes coffee break before we commence to our next agenda, which is the third parallel session. So the coffee break will be extended until 10:15. Enjoy your coffee break and see you at the next session, which is the panel session. Thank you.